My name is Ted Lewis. I work with Global Exchange. I'm the Mexico Program Director and one of the co-directors of the organization. And I'm really happy to be here tonight to working with the Alliance for Social and Economic Justice. And I've been asked to deal with the issue of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and what has happened with that over the last many years. To my way of thinking, and for many people, NAFTA was a dagger at the heart of democracy, and it really is the enemy of all the things that we're trying to accomplish with the Democracy Charter and with democracy in general. What I'd like to do is go back to and talk a little bit about the origins of NAFTA and then the impact that it's had primarily in Mexico and the United States. I'm going to touch on Canada later, and then I want to talk about how NAFTA has become a weapon. It's been used by the right wing, particularly by Trump, to mobilize voters and to really distort the understanding of the American working class about what is happening, what is going on, and has been used to manipulate people. So the origins of NAFTA really go way back. One could say the 1970s, but if you look at Mexico, and I'll look at it from that perspective first, the beginnings of NAFTA really go to 1982, when Mexico's economy suffered a tremendous crash and a process of neoliberal rescue for the economy began. And this involved the participation of the international banks, which put pressure on Mexico to take away from social spending and make sure that the debt that Mexico had built up over the years, and I won't get into all of how Mexico built up that debt, but it had to do with the oil industry, and to put Mexico back in favor with the international banks. Many conditions were put on the government, and this began a deterioration of Mexico's system of subsidies for food, subsidies for education, all of the things, the good things in life in Mexico that the government was providing the people were being pulled back very directly. But NAFTA itself didn't really come into effect until later. There was a very critical election in Mexico in 1988, a fraudulent election in which a candidate who was pushing for a new way to look at Mexico, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, won the election and then was defrauded. This provided an opening for the United States. And what happened? The United States stepped into that situation, supported the fraudulent candidate, who was also an agent of what we've come to call neoliberalism. He had studied at American universities and was a willing agent of a new process. After the fraudulent election that fraudulent election, the United States also put in a new ambassador, a guy named John Negroponte, and he played a critical role in this negative transformation of Mexico and the crushing of democratic hopes in Mexico during that time. Basically, the strategy of the United States was to allow for the opening of Mexico's economy, something that was going to close down the possibilities for Mexico's democracy. How is that? Because the more that the state was disempowered and the more that neoliberalism thrived in Mexico, the less power some electoral democracy would have to change the system. The idea was to get in a race so that the power of the state and the ability of the state to actually transform the country was reduced and reduced, so that finally when democratic alignment caught up with them, there would be nothing they could do. Anyway, the treaty was negotiated between Mexico, United States, and Canada during the end of the process began at the end of the Reagan administration, but came through first Bush administration, the H.W. Bush administration, they became very close with the fraudulent leaders in Mexico, Salinas de Gortari, and created an agreement that was very detrimental to the interests of workers in the United States and workers in Mexico and workers in Canada. The agreement actually came into effect under a Democratic president. Bill Clinton came to power, and while he had talked against NAFTA as a candidate to ally himself with American working class base, when he came into power, he embraced NAFTA and brought it to fruition. And it should be mentioned, though, parenthetically, that Bill Clinton, as a result of NAFTA, there was tremendous dislocation in Mexico almost right away. And one of the effects of that was that there was a surge in migration, something that continued for nearly 20 years. But Bill Clinton, as a result, was the first American president to suggest building a wall, built walls in key places, along the border. So while we rightly condemn Trump for his efforts to build a wall, we have to look at the history of why those walls are there, where they came from, and who's truly responsible, and how that's a much bigger picture. When NAFTA came into effect, it destroyed 950,000 jobs in the United States, primarily in states like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the industrial Midwest of the United States. That's the number of jobs that were certified by the Labor Department as being destroyed. There was much greater dislocation than that went on. That's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the jobs that were lost. In Mexico, millions of people were displaced, hence the flow of migrants that we talked about. But in order to get that's where NAFTA came from. Those were the anti-democratic impulses that were behind NAFTA. But NAFTA continued on for nearly 25 years and seemed like something that was an edifice, something that was impossible to turn back. It was considered, outrageous to think that you could turn back NAFTA. But then Donald Trump came along and in his campaign said that he was going to turn back NAFTA, but his message was not one of liberation. His message was not one of democratizing our hemisphere. His message was one of exploiting very specific hurts that people had suffered because of NAFTA, and he used that to political advantage, came into power, as we all know. We won't go into that any further, and continued his campaign against NAFTA. Eventually, he bullied Canada and Mexico into negotiating a new accord that's called the USMCA. We think of it as NAFTA 2.0. And that accord is now actually in Congress. It's an element in the impeachment debate. It's something that is, current and up. One of the odd things, but it ties to what I was saying earlier, is that the president of Mexico has embraced the agreement. Mexico is the only country of the three thus far that has approved the new accord. And largely that's because over the years, Mexico was forced into dealing with NAFTA more than any other country. They suffered a distortion of their economy based on NAFTA. And now the new president, though he is at least nominally a man of the left and represents a party of the left, and for the first time in the modern history of Mexico, nevertheless, they feel that it's in their interest to simply go along with the accord as it's been dictated by the Trump administration. Meanwhile, here in the United States, the Trump administration is pushing and pushing to try and get this USMCA ratified. The pushback on that coming from the Democratic Party is pretty strong. We here in San Francisco, our representative Nancy Pelosi is the person who's keeping that from going to the floor of Congress. And the accord is also in trouble in Canada, where they're having elections today. I don't know how the elections came out in Canada, but should the NDP win, we're not going to see the new NAFTA agreement passed. They have much bigger problems in Canada right now. So this agreement is in trouble. That reflects a deep skepticism from the working class here, from people who have been working to stop the big pharma industry, that have been pushing for environmental considerations to be taken into account by these accords. They are not. This accord is just like the old one, and it is something that all of us need to be clear that we need to oppose it in its new form, just as we did in its old form. So there's a lot more that could be said, but I think in round terms, that's what I wanted to say, is that this is a dagger at the heart of democracy. It has deeply damaged the economies and the democracies of our countries. It's having a corrosive effect, and it's not something that we can embrace. We need to get rid of NAFTA and replace it with an economy that puts people first, that puts education first, that puts women first, that makes sure that we take care of each other. So no to NAFTA, no to the new NAFTA, and yes to a real, true alternative.